Hello, good evening. Welcome. This is Novara Live. I'm Aaron Bastani, and I have the pleasure tonight of being joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
Aaron, I'm very well. Well, under the circumstances, I'm doing pretty well. It's, I think, been 4 weeks since we last did this together. It feels like it's been decades with the amount of stuff that's happened. So let's see if we can make sense of some of it tonight.
It really does, doesn't it? Just before we went live on air, some really extraordinary stuff is unfolding in West Asia, Iran. We'll talk about all of that, of course. Coming up tonight, I'm joined by Trita Parsi to discuss the latest in the Iran-Israel conflict. At least 70 more Palestinians have been massacred while waiting for food, of all things. We look into Baroness Louise Casey's report into group-based sexual exploitation, and there appears to be a split forming within the MAGA coalition. Is Donald Trump really facing a big set of problems? We'll talk about that. Really fascinating stuff. Israel's war on Iran has entered its fifth day, with Israel saying it has struck Iran's nuclear sites in the west of the country. In return, Iran has said it has struck a center of the Mossad, Israel's spy agency in Tel Aviv. That left the building in flames. But the real question now is where the US stands on this escalating war. Will the country's president, Donald Trump, provide Israel with the military support it needs to carry out its plan to topple the Islamic Republic? Speaking on Air Force One overnight, Trump said this about his goals for the region.
Remember, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. We don't have to go too deep into it. They just can't have a nuclear weapon.
What are you looking for here?
An end. A real end, not a ceasefire. An end.
So something that would be permanent.
Yeah, or giving up entirely.
An end, giving up entirely, obviously very ambiguous. Nobody really knows what that means, whether those conditions can even be met. Just before we came on air, Trump posted this on his social media platform, Truth Social. Unconditional surrender. And then following that, we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He's an easy target, but is safe there. We are not going to take him out, kill, at least not for now. We don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Just to be clear, that's referring to a head of state. We're entering a very lawless period of modern history. Joining me now, live from Washington, D.C., is Trita Parsi. Mr. Parsi is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, as well as the founder and former president of the National Iranian-American Council. Trita, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks particularly for joining us under the circumstances. I want to start with Trump. You made a tweet, a post on X about this in the last day or two, and it really hit me. Trump, of course, came into office promising all kinds of deals. He was the deal maker in chief in Gaza, Ukraine, Iran. So far, he has no deals. Why is that?
It's different in different places, of course. I can speak so much to what's happening in Ukraine and the negotiations there. But in the Iranian case, it's actually not that complicated. It's because he adopted the zero enrichment objective halfway through the negotiations. When it first started off, their position was actually a very realistic one, limiting the nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. But then they were accused of making a deal that was too similar to Obama's deal, and that seems to have gone under his skin. He shifted to zero enrichment, even though that is the objective that the US unsuccessfully pursued for 20 years and actually was quite counterproductive. As soon as he did that, under the pressure from the Israelis, of course, the talks began to stall. Once they stalled, the Israelis took advantage of it to tell him, look, we can unbreak this deadlock by bombing them. And then you'll get your deal and you'll get the capitulation you're looking for. Knowing very well, of course, that zero enrichment would lead to bombing would lead to dragging the US into the war. And now we see that they don't really have to drag that much because Trump is essentially rushing into this war with some of the tweets that he's been making today. And this is very different because just 24 hours ago, in conversations I had with folks from the administration, they were confident that he would not go into war unless the US itself was attacked. And now that's completely changed.
Where do you think this has come from? Because Trump has been actually quite emollient towards the Iranians over the last several months. Many Iranians I spoke to, both inside Iran and also here in the UK, were actually optimistic, almost in a strange way, about his presidency and what it can mean, not just for the region, but particularly for Iran. Where has this come from? I mean, we can say obviously the Israelis have tried to push him into this, but it now feels it has its own sense of internal momentum. Are there any other explanations beyond Netanyahu being the proverbial tail that wags the dog?
It really is difficult to see any other factor here, because it's not as if he is getting pushed by other people inside his own administration towards doing this. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This is not where a lot of folks actually wanted to go. And there is, in the America First movement, including very senior people that are close to him, a lot of anger and disappointment, a sense of betrayal that he's doing this. And we're seeing that he's increasingly just talking to the voices that want him to do this from outside the administration. Some donors, key people of that kind, as well as the Israelis. So it really does not seem to be coming from anywhere else than that. But they managed to somehow really convince him that this is the right way to do it, that he's going to succeed, that this is going to be a cakewalk. The Iranians are extremely weak. Without a doubt, the Iranians have taken huge hits. They have also inflicted significant damage on Israel. In fact, if the Israelis were so successful as they claim that they are, why are they going back to the US and asking the US to end the war? The entire idea was that they were going to do it on their own, and the US did not need to step in. Within 24, 48 hours, they came back to Washington and begged the US to step in.
And how has all of this changed sentiment within Iran, inside Iran, towards nuclear enrichment to the extent that it would allow nuclear weapons? Obviously, the argument made with nuclear weapons is they are the deterrent par excellence. And when a country is being potentially flattened, which is what Iran is now facing, that argument becomes a lot more alluring. Have the events of the last week, has Trump's bombast on social media, will the events probably that we're about to see in the next 72 hours, are they catalyzing actually greater levels of consent for Iran getting nuclear weapons? Or are rather people just too scared to even think at that level? Obviously, now it's just about existence, survival, avoiding balkanization, etc. Where are public sentiments in regards to the nuclear weapons question?
Obviously, there's not been any clear polls that have been made under these circumstances that I've seen. But based on what I'm seeing on Iranian TV, what I'm seeing from what society is producing, talking to people in Iran, I see a very clear picture. First of all, movement towards or strength of the voices looking for weaponization already started 2 years ago because of Gaza. Because of Gaza and the manner in which the United States essentially took all restrictions off of Israel and allowed Israel to do whatever it wanted, impunity of a kind we've never seen before. That already started a movement inside of Iran and within the elite pushing against negotiations, saying that actually what originally was supposed to be leverage for a negotiation to be able to come to modus vivendi with the West has now shifted towards something that is actually needed. Those who were favoring negotiation were actually in a hurry to get the talk started precisely because they knew that they were starting to lose the debate inside in terms of whether to negotiate away the key parts of the program or to move towards weaponization. That then has dramatically changed further in the last couple of days because of the manner in which Israel has bombed Iran, the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, the manner in which Trump seems to take pride in having deceived the Iranians, allowing the Israelis to bomb 2 days before the negotiations were taking place. So I think that has shifted things, at least at this moment, in the direction that they want a nuclear deterrence, which of course a lot of people had predicted. Former heads of the IEA had said that the fastest way of ensuring that Iran actually gets a bomb is by bombing. Because once you get bombed, your desire for a nuclear deterrence skyrockets.
But technically, how plausible would that be? Obviously, the main reason we're told that the Israelis want to introduce the Americans into this conflict is that they uniquely have this weapon, this 30,000-pound payload bomb, which could potentially destroy the key nuclear enrichment facility that the Iranians have, sentiment might increase. People might be more favorable, more amenable to developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, of course, the technical ability to do that might disappear. Can the Americans, in your view, set back the Iranian nuclear campaign?
They can certainly
so
set
to
it
speak?
back.
How much?
The bombing campaign certainly can set it back. The U.S. estimates itself is no more than a year or 2 years. But the issue is that you can blow up the facilities, you can blow up the machines. The Iranians already have the know-how, and they can reconstitute it. And they can reconstitute a program that is strictly weapons. You have to keep in mind, when you have a large number of centrifuges, that's what you need to do to produce nuclear energy on an industrial scale. If you want to build a bomb, you need a much smaller facility and a much smaller number of centrifuges. If I'm not mistaken, the Brits built their first bomb in a basement with no more than 20 centrifuges. So it's a completely different program that is weaponized and a program that is actually designed to create civilian nuclear fuel.
Mm. And of course, it's really important to say, the technically difficult part is, of course, the delivery thing, the delivery mechanism, the ballistic missiles, the hypersonic missiles in Iran, as we've seen in recent days, is pretty competent when it comes to those. My final question, the Iranian diaspora, large parts of the Iranian diaspora, particularly in the Anglophone world, the US, the UK, particularly the US, I must say, I think, have been especially vocally critical of Tehran. They have been, I think, irrationally optimistic about what a post-regime change Iran might look like. Some of those individuals supporting, for instance, the son of the formerly deposed king, Reza Pahlavi, some of those people initially cheered on the idea of Israel seeking to remove the government and seeking to dismantle the Islamic Republic. Now, having seen images, of course, of Tehran being subject to bombardment, children dying, we see the videos and the photos online and whatnot, are sentiments changing among elements of the Iranian diaspora, which were previously very favorably disposed to regime change?
I think, first of all, the idea of regime change has always been quite strong because this regime has never been popular. I think the differentiation that existed before was that there was two different ways. Either you could have democratization or you could have regime change. Regime change is unspecific about what you change it to. Democratization is specific what the end goal is, not just the process. And the democratization project, I think, had a lot of support because it essentially was associated with the reform movement, that slowly but surely, gradually, the system could be reformed into something that would become truly democratic. Faith in that has been lost to a very large extent, particularly amongst the younger generation. And we saw that with the Masa Amini protests. These were not protests that called for a restructuring of the system, a reform of the system. It, from the very beginning, called for an overthrow of the system. This is a generation who feel like the previous generation invested in the reform movement and had nothing to show for it. But that movement, the revolutionary movement, also failed. And we ended up in a scenario in which much of the Iranian society remained very much opposed to the regime, but had kind of lost any theory of change, of how that change would come about. Reform had not worked, revolution and protest had not worked. So a bit of an apathy was created. And I think also in the diaspora, anger towards the regime, of course, remained, but you could start to see how it started to become more nuanced because they saw how the sanctions, how the government of Raisi was so repressive that the people were actually suffering even more internally. And that's part of the reason why, at the end of the day, although voter turnout was dramatically low, Pezeshkian nevertheless managed to win the elections after Raisi died in that helicopter crash. Now what you're seeing is that when the Pahlavi has gone out and essentially acted as a spokesperson for the IDF, using the same talking points that the IDF spokespersons use whenever they want to explain away a hospital that they bombed in Gaza, children that they killed in Gaza, refugees in tents that they burnt alive in Gaza, those same talking points in order to say, well, the Israelis did not intend for this. They were actually really trying to avoid civilian targets. And I think it just killed whatever little credibility he had Because as much as people hate this regime to a very large extent, they love their country, and they're not looking for the country to be burned to the ground by a foreign invader in order to get rid of the regime. This is not the process that they were looking for. And endorsing it in the manner that he did, I think, has shocked a lot of people. And you can see on social media and elsewhere the outcry against it. And just today, I didn't read the whole thing, but I think his daughter issued some form of a tweet message, Instagram, I don't remember where it was, but it essentially looked at something as a PR consultant had written to essentially try to express some degree of sympathy for the people of Iran as they are now suffering under this bombardment.
Of course, she made that initial post, I think it was on Instagram stories, wasn't it? You know, effectively supporting Israel bombing her compatriots. Final question.
And his
Trita.
wife essentially, his wife fully endorsed what the Israelis were doing. And of course, all of these images of them visiting Israel, being met at the airport by the intelligence minister of Israel, just completed the picture of what's really taking place here, which is that at the end of the day, whatever support base he thinks he has, it is based on the support that he's receiving from the Israelis.
Yeah, I mean, my view is at this point he's an Israeli asset, but we can park that. What are the next, I was going to say 6 months, Trita, but at this pace, who knows? What do you think the next month, 6 weeks holds for Iran? Do you think that the regime can hold together? You know, I know very smart people like yourself, both sides of the Atlantic, have tried to model this out for a really long time. In your view, if there's at least an intervention by the US Air Force, but not ground troops involved, how does this play out, or at least plausibly play out?
I mean, I think we will find out in the next 24 to 72 hours, to be frank with you. I think that's how close we are to that scenario. I think first, we have to recognize that if you're sitting inside of this regime in Tehran, you most likely do not see capitulation as an option. Because capitulation requires that you have some degree of confidence that Trump will respect the terms of the capitulation, and that actually ends the conflict, and there's an outcome after that is somewhat stable. I don't think they have that confidence in him at all, based on how he has behaved for the last 7 or so days. Secondly, I think they have lost confidence in his ability to say no to the Israelis. And the Israelis will not be content with just dismantling the nuclear program at this point. They will make an argument, which incidentally is not an uncompelling argument, that they cannot tolerate that Iran has these missiles. It's not just the nuclear program that is a threat, it's the missile program as well. So the missiles have to be taken out. And from there on, it will just snowball into more and more demands until Israel has done to Iran exactly what it has done to Syria. Now, we saw how as soon as the Assad government fell, they bombed all of the conventional military assets of Syria, making sure that regardless of who comes to power in Syria afterwards, Syria will not be able to challenge Israel's emerging regional hegemony in any way, shape, or form for the next few decades. The same thing will be done to Iran. And on top of that, probably various forces trying to create separation of various regions of Iran, whether it's Kurdistan, Baluchistan, or other areas. So I think they don't see capitulation as an actual offer. It's an illusion. This leaves them with the option of only being able to change their fate by fighting back. They will not be able to win it, but they can inflict significant damage on the United States because of their missile capabilities. And as a result, hope that the damage is so great that they can prolong the war and the United States at some point decides to call it quits, just as Trump did after 45 days in Yemen. And use that as a way of surviving, avoiding, retaining some capabilities. It will be a devastating situation for Iran. Iran will pay an immense cost, but so will likely the United States, not on par with what Iran does, but nevertheless enough of a price that it will make Trump fear that this is not only costing him a tremendous amount of support in his America First base, but also potentially coming to define his presidency, just as the Iraq War defined and destroyed George W. Bush's presidency. That's where I think this is going. There is still a chance that this will not happen. We have seen that Trump can change his mind on a dime, and he may actually pull back. we can potentially also see a scenario in which there is some form of an understanding that the US may just go after one of these nuclear sites for though, and the Iranians won't do anything, and that after that, Trump will declare that he's destroyed the program, whether he has or not. But that would then set up Trump with a major confrontation with the Israelis, who will not be content with that. So I'm not so sure that that situation is as stable in order for it to be able to work out that way. But right now, it just seems like there's a lot of bad options, unless Trump changes his mind, recognizes that a demand for surrender will beget him war.
Trita Parsi, really, really useful information there. Not much of that right now in legacy media, although you've been doing, I think, extraordinary work across the Atlantic, but particularly with Al Jazeera. Thanks so much for joining us on tonight's show.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
You know, I've been tweeting about this nonstop, by the way. Trita, barely on UK media, highly fluent, intelligent man, apprised of all the facts. But of course, you don't see him on the BBC or I think Sky. I could be wrong. We get Reza Pahlavi instead, the Shah's son. Quickly, Kieran, a lot has changed in the last 72 hours. What do you make of these events and what happens next?
Well, I saw a Guardian piece a couple of days ago that said 3 angry men have brought us here: Netanyahu, Khamenei, and Trump. And that is just liberal bullshit. It's pure liberal cope. I have absolutely no love for the regime in Tehran whatsoever. But this started very obviously because Israel broke international law and bombed a country without provocation. And in that context, under international law, Iran has the right to defend itself proportionately. And as Mr. Parsi said, all this will do from the Iranian perspective, and if you're another state that's not allied to the United States, is give the message very clearly: we need to expedite developing nukes, right? It's the only way you can properly defend yourself or protect yourself in this context. And I say that as somebody who is obviously very pro denuclearization, very pro deproliferation and so on. But that is the takeaway. That's the message that they're sending out with actions like this. There are 1,000,001 things to criticize Barack Obama for, criticize and hate him for. I think the P5+1 deal, the deal that he did with Iran in 2015, is the single biggest achievement of his administration. Right? Just we don't need to get lost down the rabbit hole with all the details, but it froze enrichment of uranium at 3.67%, perfect for civil usage, way away from what's needed in terms of enrichment for weapons grade nuclear energy. And in return, it unfroze billions and billions of dollars in Iranian funds, sanctions, and so on. Utterly torpedoed by Trump so that he could gratify nutcases in the Republican Party. And I'll just finish, Aaron, by saying something about the Israeli nuclear program. And apologies if this has been covered on Novara Live in the past few days, but I think it's really important to say. Israel still doesn't admit that its nuclear weapons program exists. The only reason we know it exists is because in 1986, an Israeli nuclear technician called Mordechai Vanunu quit his job, went to Australia, went to Britain, and then blew the whistle on what he knew to be Israel's secret weapons program because he'd been working on it. He sold his story to the Sunday Times. The Mossad subsequently ensnared him in a honey trap, lured him to Italy, ensnared him in a honey trap, kidnapped him, brought him back to Israel, tried him behind closed doors, sentenced him to 18 years in prison, of which he served 11 in solitary confinement. And this is the country that wants to not only lecture, but bomb other countries for daring to far more transparently and compliantly have any kind of nuclear ambitions, civil or otherwise.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. There's a great book, I think The Samson Proposal, which is really about the Israeli nuclear undertaking around that time. Really, really extraordinary. At the time, the Daily Mirror was, of course, owned by Robert Maxwell. He was a Mossad agent. The editor of the Daily Mirror was reputedly also working for the Mossad, according to his ex-wife. This was all relayed to journalists at the time, and like I say, it's in the Samson proposal, I think it is. And a month after that book came out, detailing Israel's nuclear weapons program, a month after that book came out, very, very good book. We've read it, fantastic book. Robert Maxwell dies. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. And like I say, when you've got people like an editor of a national newspaper, at that point, the Daily Mirror, one of the most read newspapers in this country, and the owner are agents for a national security agency, the Mossad. If you don't think that is happening today in Britain in 2025, well, I would love to be as naive as you. We're going to talk a lot more about Iran. Look, it's most of the show tonight. Before we go on to our next story, though, we've got a very exciting event coming up. Next Wednesday, I'll be live and in conversation with French left-wing leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, leader of La France Insoumise, for an episode of Downstream IRL. As I say, that is live. It'll be held at Hackney, the Earth Theatre in Hackney. We've got some tickets left, but they're going fast. So do it right now. Follow the link in the description below. Come and see us. Jean-Luc will be there afterwards to sign books. I'll be there. You can grab a drink. Like I say, it's in Hackney. There are a few places I'd rather be than sunny Hackney in June with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. I have to be honest, it sounds fantastic. Hopefully the weather will stand up. Like I say, join us. Tickets are at the link in the description below. At least 70 Palestinians have been massacred by the Israeli military while waiting for food in Khan Yunis. The brutality of the killings is too graphic to show, but the dead bodies of scores of Palestinians were left thrown across the ground after Israeli soldiers sprayed the crowd with gunfire before firing 2 tank shells. That's according to eyewitnesses, who also say the soldiers continued firing even after the survivors fled. At least 200 other people are injured. There is an undeniable correlation between food distribution in Gaza and the mass slaughter of Palestinians by Israeli forces. In total, some 300 people have been killed and 2,000 injured while collecting food in recent weeks. And yet this is how the military of Israel has responded to this latest crime. The IDF regrets any harm to uninvolved individuals and operates to minimize harm as much as possible to them while maintaining the safety of our troops. Sounds like a health and safety primer on Ryanair. Dozens of critical cases have been received at the Nasser medical complex. The hospital is now so crowded, the medical staff were forced to treat the injured on the floors of corridors, with medics warning that they are fast running out of essential medical supplies. Samaher Mekdad was at the hospital looking for her 2 brothers and a nephew who'd been in the crowd. She said, "We don't want flour, we don't want food, we don't want anything. Why did they fire at the young people? Why? Aren't we human beings?" The level of violence being inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza has been relentless, but somehow it's getting worse. Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan is a pediatric surgeon who has twice worked in Gaza, most recently at the Nasser hospital. On Monday, she gave this evidence to the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
I just want to plead with everybody here, because when I was in Gaza last year, I remember being in the emergency department and having children laid on the floor in the yellow area, because the red triage area where we're supposed to take care of critical patients was so full. We had patients on the floor everywhere. And these children would be laid on the floor, limp, lifeless, and we would declare them dead immediately. And the ones that we don't declare dead would be fighting for one of the few intensive care beds that were available in a hospital that didn't have a pediatric intensive care unit, but whose adult intensive care unit was almost completely filled with injured and maimed children. This was last year. I remember thinking to myself, wow, this must be the worst it could possibly get. Something is going to change. We're 2 months away from the ICJ ruling on plausible genocide with provisional measures. Something will change. And it hasn't. And that's a frightening reality, to go back 1 year later, to see some of the most horrific crimes being committed in front of our eyes, to know that Aline, the 7-month-old niece of one of my colleagues, was brought to the intensive care unit, now the only survivor of her family, with eyelashes that are burned, hair that are burned, and skin that reeks of the weapons provided by Western nations, including the United Kingdom. To know that after a year of what I thought would be the absolute worst this would possibly get, it's only gotten worse.
That's a pediatric surgeon speaking to a group of MPs in the House of Commons, the legislature, the elected legislature of the British Parliament. The same British Parliament, of course, which gives rise to our government, which is allowing reconnaissance flights from an RAF base in Cyprus into Gaza. It's just a 45-minute flight pretty much every day. And most days, we're still allowing to continue the supply chain of F-35s to the Israelis. We still have our politicians saying that Israel is an ally, and with relation to Iran and Gaza, they have the right to defend themselves. Which, by the way, in Iran now includes car bombs in civilian areas. It now includes, as in Gaza, the murder of children. It includes in Lebanon with Hezbollah, probably the biggest terror attack in recent history, of course, with the exploding pages, diplomatic premises. Now you have broadcast by Donald Trump on social media, on Truth Social, they'll take out a head of state. Pure and utter lawlessness, brutality, violence, bloodlust. That lady, a pediatric surgeon, a highly qualified medical professional, is saying, I saw hell. I didn't think it could get worse. It did. And yet that same set of politicians are signing off on more support for Israel, political and military. They are, whatever they say. They're still called allies by our elected government. But because Israel won't allow Western journalists into Gaza and has killed nearly 200 of Gaza's own journalists, the testimony of doctors, like the one you just saw, has become increasingly vital for countering Israel's narrative on the genocide. But it isn't just Israel preventing witnesses from entering the territory. Egypt is playing a part too. The Global March to Gaza was due to set off from Cairo this weekend, where volunteers from around the world had gathered to draw attention to Israel's 20-month-long siege of the Strip. But the Egyptian authorities had different ideas. Marchers had been arrested, detained, deported, and attacked in an effort to break up the movement. Some of those attacks were violent. And members of the march have reported that heavies paid by the government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi carried out beatings and tried to intimidate them, with attacks taking place at various checkpoints. Police also confined marchers to hotel rooms, collected their passport numbers, and eventually deported around 500 people. On Monday, organisers called the march off, though some participants are still trying to reach the Rafah border. That is, of course, the border connecting Gaza with Egypt. But before that happened, Novara Media obtained interviews with some of the participants, including Nkosi Sikelel Mandela, the grandson of former South African President Nelson Mandela.
Well, for us, we are very hopeful that our voices will be able to get, first and foremost, to the Egyptians here on the ground and ensure that they awaken the Egyptians to also add in their voice. When we were able, as South Africans, through our government, to hold the Israeli regime accountable at the International Court of Justice, many here in Egypt, in Cairo in particular, came out on the streets shouting, Mandela's grandchildren have done it, Mandela's grandchildren have done it, while we live in fear and humiliation. So we are calling on those that feel their silence, feel that they live in fear and under humiliation, to rise. This is the moment to add in your voice so that we collectively can be able to break the siege and the blockade. But we also are here to say to the Egyptian government that you have been saying to the international community that you are calling for an immediate ceasefire and you want to have a free flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We are here as international civil society groups, civil society organizations, to support your call. We are astonished in the manner we have been treated and in the manner that we have been prevented from going to the Rafah border crossing. We thought this was your call, which we truly support. We are not here to protest in Egypt. We are trying to get to the Rafah border crossing. We have been denied access to the Rafah border crossing, where thousands of trucks have been awaiting to go into Gaza to provide humanitarian aid. It is not being able to get through the border. We want to know who's preventing these trucks from going through the border. Are we experiencing the same that the trucks are? Are they being prevented by the government from not going through into Gaza? Let us be clear that the Rafah border crossing is only controlled by two entities, the borderline of Egypt and that of Gaza. The Palestinians are not administering that border because they are wanting humanitarian aid to come into the country. The other force in this borderline is the Egyptian government. We are asking the question, why are the trucks denied access into Gaza? Why are we being denied access to the Rafah border crossing?
Novara also spoke to 3 other people on the march, all of whom have asked to remain anonymous. Here's what they said.
The first time in history we see an awareness that we've never seen before. And part of the reason for that is social media and having alternative access to other points of media that can inform us. And it's a horrific moment, but it's also an incredible moment. It's a turning point. People often say that Palestine is also freeing us, and we see that. We see that in the community that it's building. We're seeing that in the awareness that it's bringing, and we're seeing that in the way that it's empowering us. If we allow Israel to follow through, this isn't just the fall of Gaza, this is the fall of humanity, and it will turn on us. It will be the epi point of where you have the ultimate dehumanization, and that gives a signal to our leaders that none of us matter. None of us. Humanity is dead. It's, so this isn't a choice for me. This is something we have to do.
I would just say to the government that we are Swedish citizens here. We came here legally, we're abiding the laws, we're here to go on the march to Gaza. And there have been some misfortunes, and we have not had sufficient support. We have not had sufficient care. We feel like they are ignoring us. They're not reporting on what's going on. And we are citizens of the Swedish country. So we are all taxpayers. We care about the country. We want what's good for our country, for the well-being of every country. So they need to do what they can to also protect us while they're here. But again, the worst case scenario is that we might get sent back home a little bit earlier, but still the genocide towards the people in Gaza and the Palestinians is going on. So they need to follow international law and stop sending weapons to Israel, stop buying weapons from Israel, and also boycott and sanction all these things that contribute to death and mayhem. That should be a no-brainer. That should be something that we as humans need to do and can do. And I would say also that if Sweden wants to be a real voice for human rights, for human dignity, don't only talk the talk, walk the walk. Stop selling the armaments to the Israelis. Stop buying the armaments, Work for peace, not for war.
Kieran, there was response to that protest or attempted protest in Egypt. There was a response, broadly speaking, from people on the right, sort of mocking, disparaging those who were protesting, being assaulted, frankly. And that really did make me think, if they're mocking people merely trying to uphold basic rights to assembly and protest and free speech, free expression, presumably in their ideal world, the same would be the case here. What did you make of the response to that attempted and failed protest from various right-wing voices online here in the UK?
My response is that they're armchair right-wing activists. They're complete cowards. My response is that if they were subjected to a fifth of the kind of self-denial that it takes to go somewhere like that and then face, external aggression from a pretty violent and oppressive, essentially private police force in a country like Egypt, if they were subject to any element of that, they would crumble. If they were dragged away from their television studios where they prance around and shout all sorts of things about essentially powerless and defenseless groups in society and get paid mostly very handsomely for it. I'm thinking of specific commentators that I saw, typing away on Twitter about this. They wouldn't know what to do with themselves. They'd have an identity crisis. I think in brief, what I would say is that the people who did this are very, very brave. They're extremely brave and they put themselves on the line for ordinary Gazans. I just want to link this to Iran for a minute, Aaron, if I may. Because let's be absolutely clear, Israel is bombing Iran for two principal reasons. Number one, they're both linked to Gaza. And I thought of them both when we were watching some of those interviews and some of that footage. Number one, Israeli society, Israel is completely and utterly addicted to war. Right? I mean, it's at this point, they virtually have a quota of dead Palestinians and neighbors bombed that they must meet every year in order to survive as a country, as a colony. Right? That's the first thing. All the incentive structures in Israeli society are designed across Israeli society and the political class to reward violence, militarism, racism, and to punish any and everything else, basically. And that isn't surprising, obviously. We're talking about a settler colonial project founded on ethnic cleansing and a system of, very finely tuned racism that supports it, right? And a good measure of apocalyptic biblical messianicism thrown in for good measure, by the way. The second reason that Israel's doing this is to distract, and this is really the key point I wanted to make about Gaza, is to distract the world, a fickle world, from the final stages of its genocide in Gaza. I mean, it realized that when you've lost Piers Morgan and when you've even lost Nigel Farage, I mean, I'm referring to his interview with the Israeli ambassador last week, when you've lost characters like that, your international base has well and truly evaporated, right? How do you get it back? Well, you change the conversation. You change the conversation to terrorism. You change the conversation to nuclear power. You change the from an enemy. You change the conversation to Islamism, Western interests, national security, all of those totems that are so bankable and reliable in shoring up international support from the kinds of people that dominate the media and political classes. And it's worked beautifully because the people that dominate the media and political classes, by and large, are clowns with no memory, no foresight, and no backbone. Right? But the majority of the public knows, I believe, the majority of the public remains cognizant of the fact that those children that we were seeing on our television screens until very recently, with their rib cages showing, their rib cages, and their shoulder blades protruding, that those children are still starving. Only they're several days hungrier than they were when we last saw them. And I'll end on this. My family is across the way from Gaza in East Jerusalem, infinitely safer than Gaza. And it's very unlikely that they would be hit by an Iranian missile, right? Frankly. But if, heaven forfend, they were, and a member of my family were killed, I would blame one entity and one entity only. And that entity is Israel.
Yeah, I think what you said there is really spot on. Israel is a garrison state. It's a martial society. large numbers of people. Pretty much every healthy young person at some point has served in the military. And that does an extraordinary thing to a country and a people's psychology. I think you're absolutely spot on both counts. And I'd take it a step further. You're saying that this is a society addicted to war. And I think that is the perfect analogy. They need a hit. They have to have a hit. And they particularly needed a hit after what happened on October 7th. To be clear, those were war crimes. Attacks on civilians are war crimes. I would never support that. But it was a huge blow to Israel's view of itself. And part of the military response to October the 7th was to reassert within the national psyche that Israel was impenetrable, invulnerable, all-powerful. That was the point. And that's not been the case. They've not been able to do that. Hamas, nearly 2 years later, is still there. They're still there. They've had a pretty good campaign with regards to Hezbollah, but Gaza has not been completely pacified. The people are still there. They're still standing up. They're still proud. And so that blow, that injury to the Israeli national psyche after October 7th had to find another outlet because this hit wasn't being met with what they were doing in Gaza. As pathetic as that sounds, right? Killing 16,000 kids. But that's basically what it was. So it had to find another expression. And it's now finding an expression in Iran where they've started a war that they can't end. Right? People say, don't start wars that you can't end. They know they don't have to end it because, of course, they're a client state of the US, or perhaps the US is a client state of Israel. It's hard to work out which way around this is at the moment. So I think that's right. This is a society addicted to war. They need a hit. And there's a reason why Turkey and Erdogan in the last 48 hours have announced a new national strategy on medium and long-range missiles. Because they know in 10 years' time they're next. They know they're next. There's been Syria. There's been Iran. What other historic powers are there in that part of the world, in West Asia, the bridge of Europe and Asia? Turkey. They know they're next. They're not a nuclear state. So they are making steps now, I presume, to become a nuclear threshold state, at least, and also to acquire the kind of missiles I'm talking about. Secondly, the distraction thing. You're absolutely right. Last week, Nigel Farage was grilling the Israeli ambassador to the UK, saying, you're losing friends. Well, what better, smarter thing to do than to start a whole new war and tell the global media, as fickle as they are, because they are, there's nobody more fickle than journalists. Nobody. You don't need to look at Gaza anymore, by the way. 70 people died there today. 200 people injured trying to get food aid. You don't have to think about that anymore because there's a whole new juicy story in Tehran. 12 million people are being told to evacuate the city by the president via social media. And they go over there like flies to shit. I think you're entirely spot on with that, Kieran. Before we go on to our final story, many of you will have had an email from Ash Sarkar earlier to share some rare good news. I'm really happy to report that in just over 2 weeks, 1,000 people have joined Novara Media to become regular supporters. That's right. We have hit our target. It was meant to be the whole of this month. We got there in 2 weeks. So if you're one of those 1,000 people, thank you so much. Funding a media outlet is no small thing. And unlike others who have ad partnerships or paywalled content, our supporters are the reason we can do what we do. As you know, this really is a crucial time, particularly when it comes to foreign affairs, for truthful, rigorous media coverage. So your support means the world. Also, and this is really extraordinary, we have had more people joining us as supporters in the first 6 months of 2025 than the whole of 2024. The truth is, people are yearning for something different. We saw the polling with regards to whether or not you support the Iranians or the Israelis, and about 80% of the British public said, quite rightly, I don't support either of them. I don't want us to get involved in another war. Okay? That's what they said. That is in no way reflected by this country's media. It is in no way reflected by this country's political class. As I keep on saying, until the last general election, 70% of all Tory MPs in the Tory party, which was the party of government for 14 years, 70% were Conservative Friends of Israel members. The way you push back against the interference in our politics by a foreign state or by vested interests or by corporate elites is by becoming supporters of Novara Media. Go to novaramedia.com/support. The link, I think, is in the description below. help us build a new media for a different politics. We are marching to 1 million subscribers here on YouTube. I think we can do a lot between now and 2030. Frankly, we have no choice. I've been thinking about this a lot over the weekend. It was Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. What kind of a world are we giving to our kids? Whether it's living standards, whether it's infrastructure at home, housing, good work, the climate, the nature crisis, or international relations. I don't want a world for my daughter and hopefully other children to grow up in where a head of state can use their own personally owned social media platform to make death threats to a head of state and to tell a city of 12 million people, one of the world's mega cities, to evacuate their homes at 3 a.m. in the morning. I don't want that world. I'm sure you don't want it either. Help us build something different. It starts with the media. But politics can be strange. One minute you vehemently disagree with someone on one issue, the next you're unlikely bedfellows on something completely different. For instance, Nigel Farage and Tony Benn had completely different conclusions about free markets and Thatcherism, but they agreed about leaving the EU. And now something similar is happening with Iran, with the most surprising people, I think, talking a bit of common sense. Here's Tucker Carlson speaking to Steve Bannon in Steve Bannon's War Room.
I actually really love Trump. I think he's a deeply humane, kind person. And I am saying this because I'm really afraid that my country's going to be further weakened by this. I think we're going to see the end of American empire, obviously. Other nations would like to see that, and this is a perfect way to scuttle the USS America on the shoals of Iran. But it's also going to end, I believe, Trump's presidency and effectively end it. And so that's why I'm saying this.
What do you mean by that? That's coming from you. That's
you get. Look, I knew Bush. I knew George W. Bush. We had, family connections to Bush. I knew Bush personally. I still see Bush sometimes, and of course, he hates me, and he does because I criticized him on Iraq, and that war is the sum total, from a historical perspective, of his administration. But I knew him, and he had all kinds of plans for the things that he wanted to do. But once domestically, right, to improve the country. Right. And you may agree or disagree, but in his mind, he wasn't just about the invasion of Iraq in March of 2000.
Oh, no. He was going to redo Social Security. He had all types of, he was going to take care of the entitlements issue.
And he really thought it was going to work.
Yep.
And you could laugh at that or whatever, but the point is, the second you get enmeshed in a real war, not a fake, let's go bomb the villagers and declare success, though we don't even have a good track record. Why are the Houthis still there?
No,
there's a whole other question,
right,
which is how prepared is the U.S. military for a real conflict? And the answer is totally unprepared. Scary unprepared. I don't think people understand that. But anyway, the only reason I'm saying any of this is because I really, really care. And it's been, what a disaster for me personally. It's like the last thing I wake up, got all these texts, well, I can't believe you're so evil, you hate this or that. I just want to restate, I don't hate anybody. And to the extent I do hate people, I try to repent of it. I don't want to hate anybody. I really don't. I just don't want my country to be further weakened or destroyed by another one of these wars. And boy, if you can't connect the dots after 25 years of this shit, you're either too dumb to participate in the conversation, or you're, like Mark Levin, just a liar who doesn't care.
Wild, right? I couldn't agree more. On that same show, the two men who, remember, are highly prominent allies, outriders, effectively spokespeople for Trump, discussed the likely endgame with Iran.
And that Levin character will jump, you hate them. Don't hate them at all. I like them. This is crazy. What's the end game here? The end game, of course, is to topple the regime and just have this 90 million person civil war and further destroy Europe and the world. And it's like, we're not doing that again. We've already been through this. We're not doing that again. And this is big boy stuff. This is not Gaza. And I never say anything about Gaza because I really tried, very offended by it. They blew up a church in Gaza with my money. I'm a Christian. No. How about no? I said one thing about that, man. I've never heard the end of it. But I've tried to stay away from Gaza. But now we're talking about a huge country. We're talking about Southwest Asia, one of the biggest energy producers in the world.
And an ancient civilization. This is not...
Also, since you're not going to convince me that the Iranians, I'm not a Shiite. I'm not on the side of the Shiite clerics. I'm a freaking Episcopalian. Settle down. However, you're not going to convince me that the Iranian people are my enemy. Again, we're going down this here. Here's who you're required to hate. It's Orwell, man. I'm a free man. You're not telling me who I have to hate. I'll decide who I like and don't like on the basis of my values and what I believe my interests are. They spent, 5 years telling me Vladimir Putin is our enemy. No, he's not. I'm not mad at Vladimir Putin. Tell me why I should be. I'm mad at you. You know what I mean? This is like, whatever. It's all so fake. I'm not playing along.
The point about, by the way, the failed state stuff is completely correct. And it ties into what Tucker Carlson was saying with regards to the US military. Of course, the US military cannot go into Iran. Of course it cannot go into Iran. A country of 90 million people, I think geographically about 3 times the size of Iraq. But it gets worse because, of course, much of Iran is mountainous as well as desert. Some of the most hostile terrain imaginable if you want to invade a country. The idea that the US military could send troops in, which of course that's not the plan. The idea they could is outlandish. Okay, so what are they going to do with the Israelis? They're going to bomb it. They're going to bomb the shit out of a country with 90 million people. And as we've heard from Trump today, it's not just about a ceasefire, it has to end. So what does end mean? There has to be effectively a puppet regime of Israel in Tehran. That's what it means. No nukes, okay. No ballistic missiles, okay. And then you get something like post-Versailles Germany. No, you can have no military. Well, okay, then we're going to get balkanization. You're going to get bits of the country splintering up. Maybe they break it up, like Hungary or like Yugoslavia. There's going to be some kind of political resistance to that. I mean, obviously. And if you aren't going to enforce that by sending in ground troops, you're going to get a civil war. Ergo, you're going to create Syria. That is the plan. That is the plan. Best case, you're Ukraine. You have a rump state. Best case. Let's take it even further. Afghanistan. That's where Iran can be in 40 years' time. Afghanistan. And of all the people pointing this out, it's Tucker Carlson. Because there is no plan. That's the logical endpoint of all this stuff. Barely anyone in British politics or the media is willing to say something which Tucker Carlson, of all people, is saying. Shortly before that broadcast, Steve Bannon went on to the Tucker Carlson podcast. There he outlined how we are seeing the exact same playbook from the Iraq War being used all over again.
It was a mistake, but it was horrible. We allowed the architects of the Iraq War, who gravely injured the United States, got all these people killed, Americans killed, to continue to advance. They were never held to account for what they did, ever, at all.
Well, and
they became the head of the World Bank. Like, how did we do that?
The specter of that is what we've faced over the last 72 hours. This is exactly the same pitch as the Iraq War. Weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, I know.
You have to get it. So they understand one thing. They think the playbook works. This is why we have to stop it now. If we don't stop it now, it's going to work all the time. They think that playbook of lulling the American people to sleep and telling them there's these evil people that have to be taken down. And if they're taken down, everything's going to be fine after that. And that we face an apocalypse if that doesn't happen. They're running the Iraq War playbook over again with almost some of the same players, or at least the proteges.
What the hell? Steve Bannon is talking 100% crystal clear sense. And he's right, by the way. They think we also, Iraq was a disaster. Iraq was a disaster. Everybody admits that. We all know it was a disaster. Well, no, they don't think it's a disaster. They're doing the exact same thing all over again. They obviously think it's really effective. Guess what? It looks like it is. It looks like it is. Trump's behind it. You've got car bombs going off in Tehran, children being blown up. I saw a little girl on social media, she's now dead, doing a little ballet dance into a dentist chair. Young girl, 5 or 6 years old. She's dead now. She's dead, sorry. And it has consent because apparently, from the American public, from the American political class, anyway, I should say rather, it has consent from Rachel Reeves, from Politico. It has consent from all these people because, of course, well, they could get nukes, they could get WMD. Exactly like 20 years ago. By the way, Iran already has weapons of mass destruction. It already has chemical weapons. It already has biological weapons. It can deliver those weapons of mass destruction to Tel Aviv today, yesterday, last week, because their missiles are getting through, whether it's ballistic missiles or whatever, hypersonic missiles, they're getting through. So they could deliver a WMD now. They don't because of the very orthodoxy that political scientists talk about all the time, mutually assured destruction. There's no point giving millions of Israelis some hyper-intensive form of smallpox if they then vaporize Iran. There's no point. We can't let them have nukes. They already have chemical weapons. They already have biological weapons. So it's a playbook. He's right. And if it works this time, if it works a second time, they'll use it a third time and a fourth time. It'll be Turkey. It'll be Egypt. It'll be whoever. It'll be whoever. It could be Britain. It could be we have nuclear weapons, of course. It could be whoever. Israel does not have allies. It has interests. It has interests. Those interests meant bringing down Syria. Now it's Iran. It's going to be Turkey. It's going to be somebody else because they're addicted, like I say, as a garrison state to war. It was founded as a country on war and terrorism. Let's go back to those two gentlemen. Here's what Steve Bannon had to say about MAGA and how this could divide the movement behind Trump.
Well, let's have a debate. When we had a debate about the Ukraine, about the funding of Ukraine in the Senate, we beat them. This is why Mitch McConnell had to resign. Because why? Because the podcasters and influencers are much closer to the MAGA base and can deliver the heat into the House and the Senate, and they know that. I'm all for having a War Powers Act debate right now.
Exactly, I agree.
Let's have the American people weigh in, because you're going to see the American people are 90% against forever wars. And even people that support Israel are saying exactly what we're doing here. We thought we had this thing in Gaza you had to clean up with the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Next thing you know, we're bombing Tehran, and you're taking incomings. What's happened in Tel Aviv over the last 24 hours is pretty shocking, because you're taking these ballistic missiles. What's Trump's been saying? Everybody calm down. Let's get back to the table. I can get actual thing. And he said, I can get it. We can take it apart. We can blow it up if we want to, but I can cut a deal. And Witkoff and Trump, if you got to talk about two deal makers that are not like diplomats, but guys actually going to get stuff done, I feel more confidence with Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump trying to work something out than continue on the shooting war, where, trust me, with a carrier battle group heading over there and all these tankers heading over to the Middle East, we are prepping right now to come in on the offensive side of combat sorties, and that's a game changer. As bad as it is now that we're a combatant, because we are a combatant, which I say, if they're unilateral, why did we get sucked in here? Where is that decision? Where you said, hey, Steve, decisions just get made, you never know.
By the way, he's talking about how this is bad for the United States. It's even worse for Europe. A failed state of 90 million people is obviously worse for Europe. I always say this, the right don't like refugees, but they sure like making more of them. Because right now they're cheering on a conflict whose only end game is a failed state. Balkanization, 90 million people. Iranians are already coming to this country because of sanctions. And of course, many aren't, particularly enamored with the regime. Various minorities, maybe Kurds, gay, whatever. Many Iranians are already coming here via small boats. If you literally dismantle the country and balkanize it, what do you think is going to happen? And what's really fascinating is the exact same people who call Iranians economic migrants, right? So they're not really fleeing from anything. They're just coming here to get more money, to earn good wage or get welfare benefits. They're just economic migrants. So hold on. You can bomb the country. You can balkanize it. You can have the most harshest of sanctions known to man on that one country. But if people leave, they're economic migrants. Would you want to live there? I wouldn't want to live there. Really? Is that sensible? I say this all the time. The right don't like refugees. They love making more of them. And they're going to come to Europe. They're not going to go to the US. Why would they go to the US? They're going to come to Europe. And this isn't a right-wing talking point. You can dislike what I'm saying. You can say, oh, we should be more accepting. That's fine. It's going to happen. And it's going to have a massive destabilizing effect on European politics. Obviously. I'm half Iranian. I know what's going to happen. There's going to be a ton of anti-Iranian sentiment because millions of Iranians are coming to Europe because their country's been destroyed. And the people that are we whinging about it and calling them refugees and scroungers, they were the ones that wanted the country destroyed in the first place. It doesn't make any sense, does it? Doesn't make any sense. These two guys are making sense somehow. How on earth have we got to the point where Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon in the US get this, okay? I don't agree with them on basically anything else. They get this. They get the Middle East forever wars, West Asia. They get this. How come those guys get it, but there's nobody in the UK with the same politics who gets it? Very few people. You've got American, as we'll see in a moment, American far-right politicians fundamentally, who are saying this cannot happen, this is a betrayal of MAGA. And the equivalent in this country is Suella Braverman, and she's cheering it like a clapping seal. She's cheering it like a clapping seal. Higher energy prices, more refugees. Great. Fabulous. Tell me some bad news. And by the way, higher energy prices are great for guess who? America. Since the Russian war, they're exporting a ton of liquid natural gas to the European Union and to a lesser extent the UK. They're the winners in all of this. And even then, those guys are saying this is bad for us. It's terrible for the Europeans. But we have people like Ursula von der Leyen, who's literally never been elected to anything, saying this is great. Kaya Kallas, yapping like a little chihuahua. Europe is a great power. You know, we are the third pole in international relations. You are literally advancing a foreign policy agenda which is screwing your continent, you stupid person. But they don't get it. And all the talking points and the nonsense that emanates from their mouths, just repeated ad infinitum by the media. I could go on for hours. Trump wasn't especially happy about the two men's comments across both of those shows. He said this shortly before leaving the G7 summit to return to Washington.
In response to Tucker Carlson criticizing you, saying that you were complicit in the war.
I don't know what Tucker Carlson is saying. Let him go get a television network and say it so that people listen. Thank you.
This guy's so dumb, right? You won because of podcasts. You won because of the Joe Rogan Experience. You won because of Theo Von. You won because Elon bought X. You won while showing your campaign showed TV doesn't matter anymore. MSNBC, CNN, you were saying they were the failing media. Nobody watches TV anymore. And now you're saying, why doesn't Tucker Carlson go on TV? No, he's really relevant. He doesn't need to go on TV. Here's what Trump then proceeded to say on Truth Social. Somebody please explain to kooky Tucker Carlson that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Here's the thing. He can't think Carlson and Bannon are that kooky. After all, as recently as 2019, he agreed with them. Here's what Donald Trump tweeted back then. The United States has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing in the Middle East. For people listening on a podcast, $8 trillion, all caps. $8 trillion fighting and policing in the Middle East. Thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. True. Millions of people have died on the other side. True. All caps. Going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made. That guy should be president. Worse still for Trump, the likes of Charlie Kirk and Marjorie Taylor Greene are at odds with him. Here's US Representative Taylor Greene, who I would happily describe as a far-right conspiracy theorist nutjob. Tucker Carlson is one of my favorite people. He fiercely loves his wife, children, and our country. I'm sure he does. Those are good things. It's just the rest of him. Since being fired by the neocon network Fox News, true, he has more popularity and viewers than ever before, also true. He unapologetically, she's saying lots of true stuff here. This is not going to happen often, folks. He unapologetically believes the same things I do. That if we don't fight for our own country and our own people, then we will no longer have a country for our children and grandchildren. Okay, so there's kind of some stuff there that I probably don't agree with, right? Here's the money shot. And foreign wars, intervention, regime change put America last, kill innocent people, are making us broke, and will ultimately lead to our destruction. That's not kooky. That's what millions of Americans believe. She's right. What? You're probably watching this and listening. Aaron, I thought you were a leftist. You're agreeing with Marjorie Taylor Greene, like I say, a far-right nut job, and Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon. Well, you know why I'm agreeing with them? Because those guys, for whatever reason, know where the median Trump voter is at. They do. They do. They know where public sentiment in the United States is at. They don't want any more failed wars. $8 trillion was wasted. $8 trillion. They lost thousands of people. They don't want to do it again. That's why they're saying these things. They like being popular with their base. Strangely, even though similar sentiments are held by people in this country, the right is saying something completely different. It's an interesting question as to why. I'll talk about that more in a moment with Kieran. It gets even worse for the White House, somehow, because Trump disagrees with Tulsi Gabbard, his own director of national intelligence. speaking to journalists aboard Air Force One. He said this.
Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having it.
The journalist there was referring to this conclusion that Gabbard, by the way, a Trump appointee, made back in March. The United States intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized, says Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. I think The Economist had a similar piece up today. Okay, so it's Tulsi Gabbard and The Economist. But, you know, those are now Iranian talking points. If you say, Tulsi Gabbard must be an Iranian asset. What the fuck are you talking about? Before I come to you, Kieran, I just want to read this post on X by Peter Dow. He was a big Democrat, big supporter of Hillary Clinton. He's been on a journey, to say the least. It's 2025. Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene have a clearer anti-war stance than the Democratic leadership. What a sad excuse for a party. Kieran, I think he's right. I'm pretty sure you think he's right as well. What explains that?
I mean, just to go back briefly, Aaron, I think first of all, to answer your question about why it is that in Europe we're so keen on war and in Britain we're so keen on war, or not we as in the populations, but the political class, pathetic spectres of our politicians. First of all, we're used to thinking of America as an empire, and that's right. You know, it has been for almost 100 years. But I would say that the dominant tradition and the dominant position in the United States up until World War II was actually isolationism, right? And of course, there were foreign adventures, there was foreign militarism, Spanish-American War and so on. But America basically secured its hemisphere, so the Americas, in the 1820s. And then from then on, it kind of, for 100 years or so, said, we will only engage very sporadically outside of our hemisphere, and if it's very clearly in our national interest, otherwise we won't. It's the reason that Woodrow Wilson struggled to get the United States into World War I, and it's especially the reason that FDR, Delano Roosevelt, struggled to get the United States into World War II. And I think that, not to be too kind of abstract and culturist about it, but I do think that that's soaked into the political, cultural substrate of American society. You know, that's the first thing. But there are obviously very clear material reasons for that. You know, we don't need to be abstract about it. First of all, the United States, it doesn't need to expand, and it doesn't need to do anything else to assert its hegemony. Of course, the pivot to China stuff, China's its nearest rival. Yeah, okay. So you might say there's a kind of bipolarity in the international system between China and the United States, relatively similar levels of power, although I would still argue the US outguns China. But beyond that, the United States doesn't need to overextend or overstretch itself anymore. And actually, someone said to me once, it was very true, the US could blow it. It could blow it and it could go into decline. And no doubt one day it will, but I don't know when that will be. One day it will. But it will have to work very, very hard to do that. It will have to work incredibly hard to squander what it's got because it's so vast. It's so resource rich. It's got such soft power, etc. There are so many dimensions to it. And so Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, people like that, see themselves, I suppose, as inheritors, first of all, of that kind of isolationist tradition in US history, which, as I say, was dominant until, I would argue, 1941. Afterwards, of course, it very, starkly switched. I don't doubt that. They consider themselves inheritors of that tradition. And they also probably see themselves as guardians against the United States overextending itself and leading to the kind of decline that they fear occurs with overextension in the international arena. So, yeah, and Trump's role in all of this, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Trump, like you said, he won through podcasts, he won through having these big hitters. It's been pretty obvious to me for a while that there is a widening split on the American right, especially between the libertarian right and the neoconservative right. We saw it played out on Joe Rogan's podcast, not to sound too frivolous, but I think it was an important moment. Douglas Murray, Joe Rogan, it was very clear what was going on there. They're clear embodiments of the two sides. I think that that's probably widening, and it's widening with the kind of footage that we just showed. And Trump was a lightning rod for isolationism. He was supposed to be their guy, the isolationists. It's pretty clear, and I don't want to be too crude about it, but it's pretty clear he's been captured by, well, Mr. Parsi put it well earlier, big donors, who are very pro-Israel, and Netanyahu and his government. And I think that is dragging him away from his isolationist base. And I agree with Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon on this, if nothing else. If he carries on to move further and further into the Israeli orbit like this, going back on all of his promises about keeping America out of foreign entanglements, being pro-isolationist, etc., he will lose his base in droves. And it will be because people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon act as kind of critical influencers for the MAGA base.
I agree with all that. By the way, you were saying what's captured Trump. Maybe you don't want to say it. The Zionist lobby. I know people, it's a dog. No, there's a Zionist lobby. I talked about this at length with Ilan Pape. A great interview we did on Downstream, 2 million views, amazing book about the history of the Zionist lobby. By the way, I was talking about a book earlier on this evening. I think I called The Samson Proposal. I wrote it like 15 years ago. It's called The Samson Option. It was published by Seymour Hersh in October 1991. Strangely enough, Robert Maxwell, a Mossad agent who owned the Daily Mirror, died in a mysterious boat accident a month later. Funny that. But yeah, something that's not been said, by the way, a lot, and I just want to say this before we finish with tonight's show, is that Iran has been, to some extent, pursuing nuclear energy, to some extent. Weapons is questionable. Khomeini himself said that nuclear weapons were un-Islamic. Khamenei had a fatwa against nuclear technology and then just nuclear weapons. So the idea that the mullahs are pursuing nuclear weapons, it's nonsense. I mean, I don't like to use this word. It's racist nonsense because, they're religious guys. They're kind of thick. They're kind of crazy. They would be the ones pursuing the most mad thing. No, there was a fatwa given out by Khamenei resisting the impulse to get nuclear weapons. Iran's national interest was the pursuit of nuclear weapons. It was trumped by ideology, right? It's an Islamic republic. They were saying, no, it's un-Islamic to have nuclear weapons. Now, to be clear, other factions within Iranian civil society, figures in the military, the Artesh, the IRGC, politicians, etc., some did want nuclear weapons, right? And as we spoke about at the top of tonight's show, those sentiments are growing. But the idea that they were pursuing nuclear weapons as a result of clerics, ayatollahs, mad mullahs, as people with, by the way, no idea, like calling them. The minute somebody's talking about Iran and they say mad mullahs, literally turn off. Like, watch the football. They have no fucking clue what they're talking about. They have no clue. They have no clue. We have a clue. That's why you come to us at Novara Media. And I'm very happy about it. Kieran, thanks for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry, it's incredibly hot in this room, so I probably look like I've popped out for sauna while you were talking. I haven't. It's been great being here. Thanks for having me.
We're testing you. We're testing your resolve. How committed are you to Novara and our wonderful audience? And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. We are live every night, of course, on weekdays at 6. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.